Turn to them once again to the scripture reading that Brother Brad had read this morning. John chapter 13. We want to look at verses 3 to 5 once again for just a moment. John chapter 13, beginning with verse 3. Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, he rose from supper and laid aside his garments, took a towel, and girded himself. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with a towel with which he was girded. What Jesus was doing here has been described as Basin Theology, being willing to put others' needs ahead of your own agenda. Jesus described it again in Mark chapter 10. He says, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man, he says, did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Is servanthood on your agenda? When you wake up in the morning, is that the first thought that you have? Who can I serve, and how can I serve? Is that an agenda that you put first in priority in the morning? Or do you always have to be right? Always first? Do we always have to be the authority in everything? How was it that Moses could say, oh, what a great sin these people have committed. They have made themselves gods of gold, but now please forgive their sin. But if not, then blot me out of the book that you have written. Or why could Paul say, I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart, for I wish that I myself were cursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my brothers. And then, of course, Jesus, Philippians 2, he says, where he did not consider equality with God something to be grasped or held on to, but made of himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human form. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death. And then it says, even the death of the cross. All these individuals are willing to die that others might live. We've all been asked and considered the question if we would be willing to die for Christ or for someone else when we are coupled with that question, are you willing to live for Christ? It's perhaps a deeper question. Are we willing to be a nothing? Are we willing to go anywhere? And are we willing to do anything for Christ? We tend to think, though, that when we give of ourselves for others, that they will either owe us something, or we're afraid that people will take advantage of us and think then that they can walk all over us, and we get defensive. And then we think, well, I have my rights, which is true. So far I have found that as Christians we have two rights. One is found in John chapter 1, verse 12. It says, "But as many as receive him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, to those who believe in his name." The other is found in Revelation 22, verse 14. It says, "Blessed are those who do his commandments, that they may have a right to the tree of life, and may enter through the gates into the city." So the rights that we have are the rights that have been given to us as a gift from Christ. They're not mine in the sense that it is my inheritance. They are mine only in the sense that they are a gift that is given to me by the death of Christ. And then the rights seem to be conditional upon my obedience. So when I link this with a thought and those texts with 1 Corinthians chapter 6, where it says that we are not our own, but that we are bought at a price or with a price, that's how we are God's. And I come to the conclusion that whatever rights I may think I'm entitled to as a Christian, I then am willing to lay them down for the salvation of my brothers and sisters. And then God gets the glory. This is called Basin Theology, or brokenness. Remember in Matthew 21 where Jesus says, "Whoever falls on this stone will be broken." And it's only the heart, that has been at the foot of the cross can feel or understand its need, or to sense its guilt, and then to admit its own faults and failures. Only when we're able to find ourselves at the foot of the cross can we draw the conclusion that I am not my own, that I truly belong to Christ. Or maybe you're like me. Maybe you're not willing to be honest with God. Maybe you're not willing to surrender completely. There's a poem that I read some time ago. It's a poem written by a guy named Wilbert Ree. He says, maybe you've heard this. He says, "I would like to buy $3 worth of God. Not enough to explode my soul or to disturb my sleep, but just enough to equal a cup of warm milk or a snooze in the sunshine. I don't want enough of him to make me love a black or a white or an Asian or a Hispanic man, or to pick beets with a migrant. I want ecstasy, not transformation. I want the warmth of the womb, but not a new birth." He says, "I want a pound of the eternal in a paper sack. I'd like to buy $3 worth of God, please." When I read that poem, I thought, wow, what a strange concept, huh? Not wanting to leave the comfort of our zone. Sometimes we'll package God and our idea of what a religious commitment is to church and to each other's in packages of convenience. I'll do this, I'll go so far, but, when I've got other things going on, forget it. You're on your own. A quick example of one of the packages of convenience is labeled time. In Michigan, when I lived in Michigan, at the Wilson Church, there was a standing joke that the church was at the crossroads of 3 time zones. It was located in Central Time by just a couple of miles. And half the members that lived in the Eastern and could work in the Central, or vice versa. If you're just a few miles away, you could work in one and live in another, Central or Eastern zone. We actually rented a home in Wilson for a couple years one time. And he had 3 clocks on his wall. One was Central, one was Eastern. And forget what the other one was, But there's a standing joke mostly among Adventists that the third time zone is Adventist time. And that is, whenever you feel like coming, that's when you show up. Doesn't matter if anything's scheduled for that particular time. Adventists have always thought, whenever I get there, it'll be fine. At one time, Rena and I also lived in a place called Wrangell, Alaska, and we lived on an island. And to get to church, you had to take a boat. Then you had to get to the car. And then you went to the church. Well, the family that we were living with, he had this real challenge with being on time, to the point that even his wife would set the clock ahead so many minutes to try to get to a certain place on time. He was just really kind of lax that way. And I can't tell you how many times that we woke up and we got to church just as the closing hymn was being sung and people were getting up and ready to leave the church. Really felt kind of awkward, but many times that was our experience. Those of you that have been Adventists for a period of time, you've heard the term Adventist time, right? That's not a new concept. But I wonder if that may be a reason why there isn't more of an outcry among us as to why Jesus hasn't arrived yet. When he says tarries, he tarries, but being late is normal for us. So why be upset? Don't disturb my time. But the package of pride was the problem that Jesus was dealing with in the disciples that morning, as we read in John chapter 13. And their problem was, I'm not the servant to wash the feet. That's not my job description. It belongs to somebody else that's not as good as I am. When we look again at verse 3, it says that Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, Jesus knew all things. He knew who he was. He knew where he was going, and he knew where he had come from. But that he might give an example of his own voluntary humility and condescension, he rose from supper, which again he will not partake of until he returns. He laid aside his garments. As I read in Philippians chapter 2, he laid aside his divinity. He laid aside the prerogatives that he has as God. He laid aside his understanding of who he was and where he was going and where he had come from. And he girded himself as a servant. Basin Theology. As we understand it, all but one was cleansed, and all but one was broken. Each became conscious of the needs of others, especially the spiritual needs. And through their change and broken and selfless lives, they gave themselves to each other. Once Jesus was able to remove the pride, once he was able to reveal to them that he was their servant, once they got it, they became powerful men. They became special folk, special people. They gave themselves to and for each other. So am I suggesting here that we have this struggle? Am I saying that we are a selfish, self-centered church? In order to weasel out of that question, let me ask it a different way. Does anybody here besides me have a problem with pride and self-centeredness? Does anyone here besides me struggle with letting God have his own way? And letting God do what he wants to do? Anybody here besides me place limits on God? So I think the lesson that Jesus was showing to his disciples is clear and applicable to us as well. I need to listen more carefully and respond more fully to what he's trying to tell me. And I pray that that would be what we wake up with every morning. Placing on our agenda servanthood as part of the priority of what my life would be. But again, it only comes when I recognize the depth of the servanthood that Jesus was willing to go, condescend himself to become our Savior and our servant. May that be the desire of our hearts as well.